Welcome to the strange and unsettling world of terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, here to bring you the fourth and final installment of The Shadows Behind the Shadows, where I examine some of the literary and cinematic and theatrical sources behind the various Dark Shadows storylines. But before we get to the show, I want to apprise you of some special news. First of all, I want to tell you that I did a couple of great podcast episodes recently. A while back, I forgot to mention this earlier, a while back I was on the back room at the Blue Whale podcast with the delightful Catherine Gonzalez. It was episode 6, as I recall, and we had a whole lot of fun chatting about all things Dark Shadows. And then just recently, I was on the Resident of Collinwood podcast with Jewel T. Sains, Samantha Lomusio, Patrick McRae, and Alan Gallant, where we talked about bringing a mummy to Dark Shadows, which is something that I have been pursuing for some time as far as Dark Shadows mysteries go. It is the kind of the lost storyline, or perhaps probably one of many, but it's one that there have been a lot of rumors surrounding this purported mummy storyline. A couple of things mentioned in print over the years by writers and Dan Curtis, and there's not much information on it, but if I ever gather enough information on this mummy storyline, I would love to do an episode on it. So if there are any people from the behind-the-scenes world of Dark Shadows listening who possibly worked on the show or have some of that paperwork, I would really love to know a little bit more about that. But I have some dribs and drabs that I'm aware of. But anyway, we had a fun time talking about how you could bring a mummy to Dark Shadows. So I will link to both the back room at the Blue Whale and Resident of Collinwood in the show notes. Now, continuing on, I want to let you know about some cool things that are happening. John F. Warenius, who is a regular Terror at Collinwood listener who has been corresponding with me for a few years now, has written a book about Montague Summers. The book is called Montague Summers, Occultist. I've referenced Montague Summers a few times in this podcast, actually, and I know John references Dark Shadows in this new book. He does go into Dark Shadows there in part of the book. It is a really cool book. I got to take a sneak peek at it. So the book, again, is Montague Summers, Occultist, a study of the writings on witches, vampires, and werewolves. You can pre-order the book from McFarlane Books or Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com, wherever you like getting your books. You can pre-order John's new book. I will include that link in the show notes. More information here about a variety of things coming up. Since we are in the anniversary year of Dark Shadows, the 60th anniversary year, there's a lot of news coming left and right. This comes from the Dark Shadows news page. Continuing its slate of special 60th anniversary releases, note for note, Music will be reissuing the original 1969 Dark Shadows soundtrack album as an expanded edition 2 LP blue vinyl LP collecting 32 of the show's most popular Robert Cobert compositions. The 2 LP set comes in a special gatefold jacket and will debut at the Dark Shadows 60th anniversary event in Los Angeles on July 31st through August 1st. Mail order information will be posted when available. A special Bob Cobert Spooky Sounds collection will follow from Note for Note later this year. So very cool. More news. Samantha Lomusio just announced that the Curious Characters of 1897 Collinwood is now available on Amazon. It is the series of children's books that is being done by Samantha and George Hernandez. It's $19.94, and you can order it now on Amazon to go with your Curious Characters of 1795. And I know more are coming after 1897 too. As I've mentioned before, the Dark Shadows Noir classic black and white photography book from Dan Curtis Productions Archive is available now for pre-order through Hermes Press. It's compiled and edited by Jim Pearson, 256 pages, 8x10 hardcover, $65. Hermes Press also announced pre-orders for Dark Shadows #1 Gold Key Facsimile Edition. So this is a reissue of the first issue of the Gold Key Dark Shadows comic, which is really cool. It's $9.99, and it has the poster, even that hard-to-get poster. It's tough to find issue 1 of the Gold Key Dark Shadows comic with that poster intact. So this is reprinting the entire shebang here, so you can get that It says a complete facsimile of the 1968 Gold Key #1, exactly as it appeared when originally published, with a glossy heavy cover together with the rare poster. And it's a limited print run of 1,500 copies. Also, the Curse of Dark Shadows graphic novel revised expanded edition with an all-new cover by Jock is coming. The revised edition puts the sold-out smash hit graphic novel back in print, containing classic characters from the cult television show. All new character portraits as a bonus by Jock are included, and it's $19.99, so you can pre-order the revised expanded edition of the graphic novel, which I believe will correct the double printed pages in the standard edition that was recently released. So if you want to pick that up, plus there's bonus content in there, sounds really cool. Some other news here. Nick Knight 9268 on YouTube let me know that there is a podcast called The Articulate Coven Anne Rice's Immortal Universe, where Joel, the host, is watching every episode of Dark Shadows for the first time ever and giving his reaction. He is right now on episode 206, so I will post a link in the show notes to The Articulate Coven Anne Rice's Immortal Universe. That sounds really cool. Continuing on, the UCLA 60th Anniversary Dark Shadows screening event at the UCLA Hammer Museum is coming up on June 27th at 7:30 p.m. Admission is free. There'll be a Q&A with actor David Selby and historian Jim Pearson, an introduction by Catherine Lee Scott via video. There'll be a book signing of Dark Shadows Noir with Jim before the screening. 3 Dark Shadows episodes will be shown, plus additional material. And I've been saying this every episode, if you don't have your tickets yet for the big Dark Shadows 60th Anniversary Festival, the big Dark Shadows 60th Anniversary event, I guess they're not technically referring to it as a festival, but everybody's calling it a festival. I'm calling it a festival. It is what it is. Let's own it. Let's embrace it. It's a Dark Shadows festival. It's the last Dark Shadows festival. The tickets are still available via Eventbrite for the Dark Shadows 60th Anniversary event. Be sure to snag them while you can. I know there are still tickets available. There are a lot of people going, so if you want to go, I strongly advise you, if you can go, and if you want to go, it's going to be happening July 31st, August 1st, and August 2nd. The August 2nd is more of an off-site event, tour of the Greystone Mansion, which was used in the 1991 Dark Shadows series, and then the 31st and the 1st are going to be at the hotel events with lots of panels and a dealer's room, screenings, costume contest, autograph signings, all kinds of cool stuff going on. This is the last big Dark Shadows event as far as the festivals go. Yes, Catherine Lee Scott actually did announce that there is going to be a Halloween Dark Shadows event at Lyndhurst. So when I hear more information about that, I will certainly relay it on the podcast. And for East Coasters who maybe can't make it out to LA, there is going to be a Lyndhurst event. Smaller scale event. Those Lyndhurst events are really fun, but they are smaller scale than what we're looking at here for the 60th anniversary event, which is a very large gathering of actors from the series. Vendor room, I mean, it's the whole 9 yards as far as a convention experience goes. So, or festival, festival. No, not festival, event. Okay, so, but that's it. On that note, let's get to the show.
Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead.
Welcome to the Shadows Behind the Shadows, Part 4, the final installment of my look at the cinematic, theatrical, literary influences on the various Dark Shadows storylines. So, as we've seen so far from parts 1, 2, and 3, Dark Shadows really captures the Gothic aesthetic, the Gothic archetypes. All of those characteristics make their way into Dark Shadows. However, where Dark Shadows really stands apart is in its subversion of the Gothic. So all of those characteristics are intact, and it's a good representation of the Gothic, but in true 60s counterculture fashion, the monsters of the show, which previously are depicted as the force that we must oppose, now these creatures are front and center. They become the protagonists of the show. For the first time, you get a vampire as the protagonist. That was unheard of before that, right? And you get not only supernatural characters, but these sort of eccentrics and oddball characters who are kind of the ones who resonate a lot with audiences. That's not to say that the quote-unquote normal characters in the show are not fascinating as well. And many of them are also pulled from Gothic archetypes. Like, for instance, Victoria Winters is the Jane Eyre character, the governess who enters this house of mystery. Speaking of mystery, it's not only Gothic horror and Gothic romance that we're looking at. Dark Shadows has this foundation of terror and mystery and the supernatural. It also takes a lot of inspiration, as we've seen too, from suspense thrillers, things like Gaslight or Suspicion. They were pulling a lot from that too, which of course fits very well with the whole aesthetic of the show. And, historical adventure stories too, like the Count of Monte Cristo, so some of that finds its way into the mix. So it's not only horror stories. I use the word horror as an umbrella term. Dark Shadows is more terror than horror. There are certainly moments of horror in Dark Shadows. Maggie Evans having that nightmare where she sees herself dead and then you see her face is a skull and she's screaming and holding her face. That's horror. That's just a moment of horror there. But it's, the umbrella term for the genre is horror. You don't really hear people say, I'm going to go see a terror movie. Most people say, I'm going to go see a horror movie. Boris Karloff used to correct people on this too. I do not make horror films. I make terror films. I talked a bit in the past about Anne Radcliffe and the distinction between horror and terror. They go hand in hand. Dark Shadows has both, but it's primarily terror. But anyway, it takes inspiration from other sources as well. Suspense thrillers, historical adventure stories, even Nicholas Nickleby, so there are a lot of things peppering the stew of Dark Shadows. And with that in mind, I want to continue on to look at these storylines and the inspirations for the final storylines of the show. So 1995 storyline is only 2 weeks long, and it sets up what's going to happen in the summer of 1970 and later 1840 as well. But the 1995 storyline, I can't find anything distinct in there to really talk about versus what I'm going to talk about for summer of 1970, also known as the Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard storyline that takes place after 1995, because that kind of leads into that. So I can't think of any specific thing. I mean, they go into the future, yes, but as always with Dark Shadows, time travel is not done through the use of science fiction methods like time machines, etc. It's a very mystical experience. It's a very strange metaphysical transportation that takes place to the future. So there's no explanation. They don't explain. If it was a sci-fi show, they'd show you the machinery that was created to take you to the future, etc. This is all occult based in Dark Shadows. Even Quentin's Stairway Through Time, he calls it a metaphysical experiment. So they were always very careful to frame it in the context of the occult and the supernatural versus, something like H.G. Wells' Time Machine, where they build a time machine and there are doodads in it and things like that. It's just the different shades of where they lean in terms of how it's presented. So let's look at 1995 going into the summer of 1970, aka the Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard. Now, the one that everyone calls out and kind of gripes about is that they went back and did Turn of the Screw again. Yes and no. There are certainly elements of Turn of the Screw by Henry James, 1898 psychological Gothic novella, which follows a young governess hired to care for 2 children, Miles and Flora, at a remote English estate. She becomes convinced they are being corrupted by malevolent ghosts, leading to a tragic, ambiguous climax. So the Turn of the Screw they did with Quentin and Beth. They are using aspects of the Turn of the Screw here. I mean, you have a malevolent male spirit, you have a female spirit who's ambiguous in terms of whether she's good or evil. And then you have, in the novel, it's 2 children. In the Quentin's Ghost storyline, it was 2 children. Now we're looking at 2 teenagers, because David Hennessy, I think, was 14 at this point, or 13 going on 14. I'm pretty sure he was already 14 here. And Hallie Stokes, who was, I think, 16 here. So now it's a different vibe now, because we're dealing with teenagers and 2 spirits. But it's not on the nose turn of the screw like Quentin's Ghost storyline was. But there are some aspects of turn of the screw worked into this. But it's a totally different storyline from the Ghost of Quentin Collins storyline. Totally distinct, because there are other elements that are woven into this storyline. So you have some turn of the screw. But then we go to the next big piece here, which is the Beckoning Fair one. And I recommend you go back, if you haven't listened to it, and listen to the episode I did on the Summer of 1970 storyline with Steve Schutt and David Wingrove, where we go over some of these literary inspirations for this. The Beckoning Fair one, I did an interview. Ed Gross interviewed me for Women's World Online. I talked a little bit about this story. The Beckoning Fair one was published in 1911. It's written by Oliver Onions, and it's a psychological horror novella about Paul Oleron, a struggling novelist who rents an isolated, empty London apartment to focus on his writing. He slowly becomes deeply enamored and obsessed with an unseen female spirit in the building, the fair one, draining his willpower and driving him to madness. In the story, this novelist falls in love with this unseen spirit. It's very vague, but there are all these hints that he hears a woman brushing her hair, and he just becomes infatuated with this spirit to the point. I don't want to spoil the ending of the story, but let's just say he betrays his friends in it. And this story was the basis for the Quentin and Daphne's ghost subplot happening during the summer of 1970, aka Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard. Quentin becomes obsessed with the ghost of Daphne, and we see this in 1995 too. It starts in 1995. We already see Quentin is still obsessed with Daphne, but he becomes obsessed with Daphne to the point where he is betraying his friends. He's lying to Barnabas and Julia about what's going on. And Daphne, at first, is a very enigmatic figure. We see her hugging Quentin, and she's holding the knife behind his back and all this, so we don't know where her loyalties lie. Ultimately, she turns on Gerard and cares about the children, etc. But the thread running through that is the Beckoning Fair one. Now, that was also used in Night of Dark Shadows, and we talked about this in the episode with Steve and David. There's a 1968 adaptation of the Beckoning Fair one from the British anthology series called Journey to the Unknown, produced by Hammer, by the way. The story, and I think even more so, this version of it is one of the inspirations for Night of Dark Shadows. It's on YouTube, adaptation of the Beckoning Fair one. There's some Night of Dark Shadows elements in this version of it. The man is an artist, not a writer, and he's married to, or I don't remember if he's married or if it's, his fiancée or something like that. And he becomes, again, obsessed with this spirit in his flat. You hear her laughing and stuff like that. It's very, Angelique's ghost and Quentin, the artist, in Night of Dark Shadows. Plus, there are other ingredients in Night of Dark Shadows, too. Rebecca is in there. Carlotta has a lot of Mrs. Danvers vibes going on. The Haunted Palace, Roger Corman's adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, which I talked about when we talked about 1970 Parallel Time. That's in the mix there, too. Definitely some inspirations for Night of Dark Shadows. There are some threads that run through that. Now, another really interesting part of the summer 1970 storyline is the playroom, which we first see in 1995, but then in summer of 1970, we see the playroom disappears and it's not there, and then it reappears. That idea was probably inspired by Number 13 by M.R. James, and I think Steve brought this up when we were talking about it in the podcast episode. I'm sure he did, in fact. It was published in 1904, and the story concerns a visiting British academic, Anderson, who stays in room 12 at a Danish hotel. He discovers that a mysterious phantom room 13 only appears at night, harboring an invisible, malevolent entity that distorts his own room and terrorizes the hotel. Late at night, a physical door for room 13 inexplicably materializes next to his. From inside, he hears ominous chanting and sounds of a frantic, hissing presence. By morning, the door and the room vanish, completely leaving no trace. So this disappearing, reappearing phantom room, a ghost room, if you will, is exactly what the playroom is. In this instance, it's not a playroom, it's a hotel room, but it's a similar concept. So M.R. James was an excellent writer of ghost stories. If you have not read M.R. James, please go read M.R. James. I talked about Casting the Runes in the last episode of Shadows Behind the Shadows, and this is another M.R. James story, and I'm going to mention another one which may have been an inspiration. The Haunted Doll's House is a 1923 short story by M.R. James, wherein an antique dealer named Mr. Dillett purchases a highly intricate 18th century dollhouse. At 1 a.m., the dollhouse springs to life, revealing a ghostly, silent reenactment of a sinister murder. Later, Dillett finds the Merriweather family of nearby Ilbridge House had lost 2 children in the mid-18th century, and their father was a promising architect who had made at least one architectural model. Visiting Ilbridge House, he finds that it is in ruins and quite unrecognizable, but notes how the chime of the church clock is startlingly familiar. This short story may have loosely inspired the goings-on regarding the mysterious dollhouse within the playroom, along with its full-sized counterpart, Rose Cottage, during the summer of 1970 storyline. It's possible because you're dealing with the haunted dollhouse, but it has a counterpart in real life where some bad things took place. Could be. I kind of feel like they had M.R. James on the brain around this time, so it's possible that was in the mix. And then last thing for summer 1970, aka Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard. I always called it back in the fanzine days. I remember it always being referred to as the summer of 1970 storyline. That was typically how it was referred to, as far as I can remember. But in recent years, I think since the Dark Shadows Almanac came out, it's been referred to as the Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard. When I say summer of 1970, I'm referring to Ghosts of Daphne and Gerard present day storyline. I like summer of 1970, although it goes into the fall a little bit, the beginning of fall, but mostly it takes place during the summer. Carmilla is the last one I want to talk about here. Published in 1872 and written by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, Carmilla is a foundational Gothic novella that predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by 26 years. The narrative follows Laura, who lives in a secluded Austrian castle as she becomes both the friend and target of an alluring female vampire named Carmilla. So Roxanne preying on Maggie during the summer of 1970 storyline was probably inspired by Le Fanu's novella. Loosely. I mean, it's not a direct adaptation. Just the idea of a young woman being preyed upon by a female vampire has a very Carmilla ring to it. And in the novel, Laura's friend, Carmilla, is later revealed to be Mircalla, the Countess Karnstein. So I think there are elements of that in there. And in fact, the way Hallie Stokes arrives at Collinwood, she has nothing to do with the vampire story, but the way she arrives at Collinwood is very much how Carmilla arrives. Her parents are supposedly killed in a carriage accident, right? So, and this was Hallie's parents were killed in a car accident. They probably read Carmilla around this time, or it may have been in the Rolodex of horror. And for those who may not know what I'm talking about there, so Dan Curtis, during the run of the show, supposedly hired speed readers, a speed reader or multiple speed readers, I don't know, to read all of these horror stories and summarize them. And they had a Rolodex with summaries of a ton of horror stories. If there was one thing I would love to have from the Dark Shadows, pantheon, it would be the infamous Rolodex of horror. I would love to see what else is in there. I'm sure it's long gone, but summaries as they pull it out during writers' meetings. Now, let's talk about the 1840 storyline, the foundation for the 1840 storyline. There is no hint of what is to come with regard to the head of Judah Zachary in 1995 or the summer of 1970. That is a big reveal in 1840. The head of Judah Zachary is directly inspired by The Thing That Couldn't Die, which is a 1958 drive-in horror film from Universal Studios about a severed warlock's head that possesses various people to do its bidding in an effort to force them to find its missing body. In the motion picture, a young, psychically gifted woman named Jessica uses a dowsing rod to search for groundwater on a California ranch, but instead unearths a sealed 16th century chest Greedy ranch workers break open the box to find the severed, still living head of Gideon Drew, a warlock and Satanist executed 400 years ago by Sir Francis Drake. Drew's head makes various people do its bidding, including Jessica, whom it hypnotizes into searching for the coffin containing its headless body. Watch The Thing That Couldn't Die if you haven't seen it. It's actually a really cool movie. But I do remember years ago, it was an online fan community. And I don't know if it was me that brought up The Thing That Couldn't Die or somebody else brought up The Thing That Couldn't Die because they were talking about inspirations for different things. And one fan took umbrage. They said something to the effect of, Dark Shadows storylines came from classic literature, not drive-in B-movies. Well, I got news for you. It's The Thing That Couldn't Die. I mean, just absolutely no doubt about it. Watch the movie. That's the Head of Judah Zachary storyline. And incidentally, there's a 1973 film called Horror Rises from the Tomb. It's a Paul Naschy movie where he plays a warlock who is decapitated and his head is found. The head is still alive and possesses people to reattach the head to the body. So it's almost become a trope. I mean, you got The Thing That Couldn't Die, you have Dark Shadows, Head of Judah Zachary, you have Horror Rises from the Tomb. Seems to be a thing with the decapitated warlocks. There are other aspects, though, in there with regard to the Dark Shadows storyline. I mean, they use some elements of Frankenstein where Julie is trying to revive the body with the lightning and the wires going to its head, with Julie and Letitia were both possessed by the Head of Judah Zachary. But there's also a nice dash of Black Sunday in there. Black Sunday is a seminal Italian Gothic horror film released in 1960 and directed by Mario Bava. It follows the resurrected witch, Princess Asa Vaija, I can never pronounce her last name, who seeks revenge on the descendants of those who executed her. And of course, it starred the great Barbara Steele. So the underground vault containing Judah Zachary's body in a coffin is pinned in place by a giant cross, as seen in episode 1125, and the mask of Baal is seen through a panel in Judah's coffin. These are direct parallels to the imagery surrounding the crypt of the ancient witch, Princess Asa, in Black Sunday, including the cross used to keep her in the crypt and the mask of Satan seen through a panel where her face should be in the coffin. That imagery absolutely pulled from Black Sunday. And I think we talked a little bit about that when I did the 1840 episode with Amanda Desiree and Catherine Cressman. We talked a little bit about the Black Sunday influence there on that part of the story. So, instead of a witch, it's a warlock, but he has the mask of Baal, he has the cross pinning the coffin lid. And I forgot to mention, Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe makes a reappearance here as well, except this time it's Lamar Trask walling Barnabas up. Now, I also have a feeling that the Joanna Mills Revenant subplot is based on something. And maybe it's just that it's such a EC Comics, Tales from the Crypt, Revenge from Beyond the Grave kind of a thing, that it just might be such a common trope that it feels like it's based on something. But I almost want to say that it's based on some specific thing. I saw in the Dark Shadows wiki somebody listed the exchange of letters between Joanna Mills and Quentin as being based on the Scarlet Letter, which I'm not really seeing that. Maybe somebody can elaborate and explain that in more detail. I have read the Scarlet Letter. It's been a while, but it never reminded me of Joanna Mills. If anything, the House of the Seven Gables is much more in line with Dark Shadows to me, of the ancestral family curse and witchcraft, etc. That's very Dark Shadows-y. Anyway, there are Hawthorne stories that I think would have worked quite well in Dark Shadows, like Rappaccini's Daughter, for example. I'm not going to go there. But if anybody has any thoughts on the Joanna Mills subplot and where that may have come from, I'd be curious to hear that. Now, finally, we go into 1841 parallel time. There are two main stories that anchor this. And it's, again, we see this repeat. This is a kind of a recurring pattern in Dark Shadows where they're going to have two plots going on at the same time, concurrently, and they just kind of line them up side by side, and they dovetail with each other. But they will pick, go to the dusty library and pick two books off the shelf, and let's combine these two things. And the unlikely pairing, which I love that they did this, it's such an unlikely pairing of Wuthering Heights and The Lottery. So Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte was published in 1847. It's a Gothic tragedy set on the Yorkshire moors. It follows the all-consuming, destructive romance between Catherine Earnshaw and the brooding foundling Heathcliff. When Catherine marries for social status, a devastated Heathcliff spends his life exacting a cruel, generational revenge on everyone who wronged him. So the Bramwell and Catherine story going on during 1841 parallel time is Wuthering Heights. I think everybody pretty much knows that. Pretty obvious there. And a lot of those elements from the story and the sort of the tempestuous nature of their relationship and Bramwell's personality, it's all Wuthering Heights going on there. And then The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is a chilling 1948 short story where a seemingly idyllic village gathers for an annual summer tradition wherein everyone in the town participates in a special lottery every year. The cheerful atmosphere shatters when the drawing reveals a dark twist. The winner is chosen by the community to be brutally stoned to death. It's a lottery you do not want to win. The winner of the lottery is the loser, for sure. So, but in Dark Shadows, if you win that lottery, you're going to end up locked in the room, the cursed lottery room, which is haunted by Brutus Collins, and you'll either go insane or die in that room. And it's funny because I see people sometimes online saying, well, the last storyline of Dark Shadows didn't have supernatural stuff going on. Are you kidding me? The lottery is not supernatural, with the Louis Edmonds dressed like something out of a Shakespeare play haunting the lottery room and people going insane because they spend the night in the room. Come on. There's still plenty of supernatural stuff happening in 1841 parallel time. Granted, the Wuthering Heights aspect of it is not supernatural. This tumultuous Gothic romance going on, but there's also the supernatural lottery plot happening, which is totally, there's possession. There's these preserved bodies covered in cobwebs. Come on, don't tell me there's no more supernatural at the end last storyline. That's ridiculous. Okay, I'll give you. It is more sedate than, say, the Adam storyline or something like that. It's a little dialed back a bit, but there's still supernatural stuff happening. And in fact, the last bit I want to mention here is the White Lady or Woman in White, which Justin Collins, sees the Woman in White. This is a type of female ghost. She's typically dressed in white. This comes from folklore. It's a type of female ghost typically dressed in white, in a white dress or similar garment, reportedly seen in rural areas and associated with local legends of tragedy. White lady legends are found in many countries around the world. Common to many of these legends is an accidental or impending death, murder, or suicide, and the theme of loss, betrayal by a husband or fiancé, and unrequited love. So there's the element, you don't see the Woman in White in Dark Shadows. For years, the Woman in White was listed as being played by Nancy Barrett. That was a mistake. She did not play the Woman in White. We never saw the Woman in White. Only the characters see the Woman in White. We don't. Okay, I may have missed stuff, and in fact, I have some housekeeping stuff here from a variety of folks who wrote in or posted. The first one comes from the illustrious Amanda Desiree. She says, I remember my high school French teacher telling us the plot of Alexandre Dumas' novel La Reine Margot, in which the queen kills one of her enemies by dusting the pages of a book with poison. The victim licks their finger before turning the pages, thus transferring the poison to their mouth and dying. I had recently seen the 1897 episodes where Tim Shaw is drugged in this manner and was excited to find a possible inspiration for that plot in addition to the Manchurian Candidate. And yes, I agree. And I actually, that is listed in the Dark Shadows wiki, I believe, as one of the sources. And I forgot to mention it last time. So thank you for bringing that up, Amanda. And then she goes on to add this. She says, I would suggest that Les Mains du Diable from 1943, which for some reason goes by the English title Carnival of Sinners instead of the direct translation The Hand of the Devil, directed by Maurice Tourneur, the father of Jacques Tourneur, who directed I Walked with a Zombie and Night of the Demon, was also an inspiration for the Count Patofi storyline. The film is a riff on Robert Louis Stevenson's story The Bottle Imp. Protagonist, a struggling artist like Charles Delaware Tate, is propelled to fame after purchasing a magic artifact, a severed human hand that is supposed to bring him good fortune as long as he lives, but will send his soul to hell if he still owns it when he dies. It's a marvelous film with very eerie visuals, and I highly recommend it to all horror fans. And I really have to look this film up. I watched some clips on YouTube, and I'll show in the video version. Amanda sent the picture of the hand in the box, which looks very much like the Count Potofi hand. I wonder if they saw, if Dan Curtis or Sam Hall or one of the Gordon Russell or somebody saw this film. Maybe this, I talked about the monkey's paw last time, but this also, I think, dovetails quite nicely with that. Thank you for sharing that, Amanda. And then she goes on to say, finally, I would argue that The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is more influential on the Roxanne plot than Sleeping Beauty. Both Roxanne and Cesare are psychic. She's clairvoyant, he can tell the future, and both exist in a long-term sleep trance. Absolutely, 100%. I totally agree with that. That is such an excellent observation. I think you are 100% on the money there, Amanda. Thank you for sharing those. Those are excellent. So thank you again. Moving on, Bad Guitar 5653 writes, by the way, I just rewatched the episode that introduces Eve and realized yet another literary movie connection. When Stokes uses the magnetic letterboard to show that Leona Eldridge is an anagram for Danielle Roget, it is a direct lift from Rosemary's Baby. Even the way the camera shoots the big moment of realization. In Rosemary's Baby, Rosemary rearranges Scrabble chips to show that Roman Castevet is really Stephen Marcato. Penny, you have me hooked on this stuff now. Welcome to the addiction. I'm glad to have turned you on to this. Thank you for sharing this, Bad Guitar. That is, did not think of that. And it's, I think because it was so close to the time of that storyline, it only come out, Rosemary's Baby had only come out a few months before they did that. But totally, yes, that is probably exactly where they got that from. Good call there. So Rosemary's Baby finally gets into Dark Shadows because for years, Alexandra Moltke joked that because she was pregnant, that she wanted to leave before Dan Curtis came up with the idea of doing a Rosemary's Baby storyline, which I have to admit would have been really cool. I mean, come on, that would have been awesome. But it would have been messed up because she was really pregnant. This one comes from Deadly Kingdom. Another possible source for the 1897 Collins family is a 1903 short story called The Shadows on the Wall by Mary E. Wilkins, later Freeman. It features adult siblings and a hassle over an inheritance. A brother named Edward gets to stay in the house despite being a profligate who spent his inheritance because of provision in his father's will. His brother Henry wants him to stay out and feels that Edward is a freeloader. Murder and ghostly shadows ensue. The title, as we know, was used for the series Bible, though that could be a coincidence. I think it's commonly accepted that the Little Foxes was the inspiration for the siblings and the whole thing over the will, but you make a good point here, too. You make a good case for that here, too, especially there's a character named Edward in it, and the hassle over the inheritance. Maybe so. I have to check out The Shadows on the Wall. I have not read that story. So thanks for sharing that, Deadly Kingdom. And then Cosmo 13 on the Classic Horror Film Board says, worth mentioning as influencing the 1897 Zombie Quentin story is the 1943 movie The Mad Ghoul. The imagery of Zombie Quentin clawing through the graveyard must have been based on similar footage of George Zucco crawling through the dirt toward a grave. He shared a couple of pictures here, so I'm going to try to use those in the YouTube version. He then goes on to add, I think the Maltese Falcon 1941 movie influenced the Count Potofi storyline further, because we talked about that last time. There, David, as the dying Sandor delivering the hand to Barnabas, replicated Captain Jacoby's death scene from the Bogart film version when Jacoby delivers a falcon to Sam Spade. And then he goes on to say, yes, Amanda Harris, Olivia Corey is based on Galatea, but I think she is also the DS equivalent of femme fatale Bridget O'Shaughnessy of the 1941 Falcon movie. Both characters are theatrical, manipulative, and untrustworthy. They both switch allegiances, cavalierly aligning themselves with whomever they think can help them achieve their selfish goals. Aristide, with his dancing lady knife, is more than just Joel Cairo. He's also assassin Wilmer Cook. Budget-conscious Dan Curtis combined Peter Lorre and Elijah Cook Jr.'s roles into the Aristide character played by Michael Stroka. And then he says, thank you also for bringing up the plot point about a werewolf reverting permanently to his wolf state if he dies while in human form. I've mentioned that to numerous Dark Shadows fans over the years, and none of them were ever aware of it. This aspect of the lycanthropy curse makes me wonder why Ghost Quentin tried to poison Chris Jennings. Does Quentin know what will happen if he and David succeed in killing Chris? Why does Quentin want to make that happen? So I have also found that there are a lot of Dark Shadows fans who did not catch that when Jeb Hawks said that, or prefer not to accept it. Jeb might not be the most reliable person, but, the werewolf is his sworn enemy, so he would probably know the strengths and weaknesses of a werewolf, right? But he did say that, and we talked about the wolf's head in the last episode by Robert E. Howard. I'm sure that's where that came from. But yeah, they did say that. And as for why Quentin wasn't a werewolf for that long before he was killed, presumably with a silver bullet in that chair in the room, I'm going to say. But he probably doesn't know that killing Chris will turn him into a werewolf permanently. Or if he does have that knowledge in the afterlife, maybe that's what he wants to happen. Barnabas wasn't only trying to save David in 1897, he was trying to save Chris too, because remember, Chris was permanently transformed into a werewolf, seemingly when he was locked in the mausoleum. They opened the secret door and he was still a werewolf. So maybe Quentin succeeded in killing Chris, but that's sad. That makes me sad, but maybe that's what turned him permanently into a werewolf, and it was reversed when Barnabas went back in time and changed history. Or Quentin just doesn't know what will happen. And maybe Quentin manifesting now is causing Chris's curse to be amplified and go haywire, to malfunction and gain in some kind of strength. Either Quentin is trying to spare Chris and end the curse. I think that's the primary theory, is that Quentin is trying to spare Chris and end the curse, and probably doesn't know that it will turn him permanently into a werewolf if he kills him. I'm going to go with that one. Okay, so the delightful Steve Shutt writes, I thought of yet more possible echoes or inspirations to bring up. One is this late 1940s film Queen of Spades with the fabulous Anton Walbrook and Edith Evans. It includes an exquisitely staged flashback featuring the Count Saint Germain, who isn't really seen, but is definitely a sort of spectral presence. It was ultimately based on a short story by Pushkin from the 1820s. Anyhow, this scene of the funeral of the Edith Evans character might have been in somebody's mind when they were staging Quentin's nightmare about Grandmama Edith, or not, but I thought of it while listening to what you said. And then a while back, and this is the last thing I'll read here, a while back Steve also wrote to me and said, I happened to view a clip of the final 10 minutes or so of the Roger Corman Vincent Price classic The Pit and the Pendulum on YouTube. I have a Blu-ray of the film, but grabbed a chance to revisit the classic sequence one weekend morning. And I'd never noticed before that Dan Curtis pretty much copied one of the final shots of the movie for the end of House of Dark Shadows. I'm enclosing screenshots for comparison. I'd been aware for years of the influence of Sam Peckinpah on the bloody climax of the movie, particularly the gore fest, the angles, and the slow-mo. But Dan also seemed to have had an unconscious memory of Pit and the Pendulum in mind when setting up his important end title shot. I think that's true, and also Return of Dracula, the ending shot of Return of Dracula has a similar look to it. So all three of those look similar to each other. But I think you're right there with the way it's staged in Pit and the Pendulum looks a lot like it looks in House of Dark Shadows. So they probably did. I think those Roger Corman post-cycle films are all over Dark Shadows. They reverberate through Dark Shadows. The whole feel and mood of those films is very, I'm sure most people listening to this have seen those Poe films by Roger Corman. I hope you have. If you haven't, please go watch them immediately. And it's pretty clear, having gone through all of these stories and films and plays, etc., that Dark Shadows could have certainly continued by drawing from the vast library of Gothic literature and thrillers and Gothic cinema, etc. In fact, I wrote an article for Daytime Gothic, the first issue of Daytime Gothic, called Gothic Steals for Fun and Profit, where I broke down 10 stories that could have been used in Dark Shadows had the show continued. So give that a read. I may do an episode devoted to that topic at some point as well. With that said, I've rambled on quite a bit here, so my voice is going. Thank you very much for listening. If you've listened to all 4 of these installments, I appreciate you doing that. And I hope it'll inspire you to maybe go check out some of these stories and some of these films that fed the Caspian Sea that is Dark Shadows. So many great things. Dark Shadows would not exist if it were not for all these stories. And if you love Dark Shadows, you should also love all of the ingredients that went into making Dark Shadows. Legendary ingredients, building blocks of horror in many cases. In the case of, Dracula and Frankenstein, Wolfman, all of this stuff is essential viewing or reading if you love Dark Shadows. Now, if you want to read more about sources that inspired Dark Shadows storylines, You can check out the list of works used in Dark Shadows on the Dark Shadows wiki, which is fairly substantial. And I think I talked about most of those, if not all of those, in this series. Also, Late Night at the Collinsport Drive-In, which was a great article written by Ansel Farage for Daytime Gothic. It's excellent. Definitely check that out if you have not done so already. It's a great article. And Dark Shadows Almanac has kind of a thumbnail look at some of the sources, although definitely not all. But the big ones are mentioned in there. So with that said, thank you very much for listening.
Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.